There we go.
It's really confusing. Some stuff is like at cost, but if you get like blue or like true,
But I think
it's at cost plus 10%. It's a good idea.
Yeah, I think I was about like, I think these two colors together, what would I get?
So they're like the program professionals thing, it's cheaper than I can get it at work. So I'm like, and I mean, our work is expensive. So like, it might be cheaper, honestly, for me to just go somewhere else and get like that.
Yeah.
The only thing I I just like, I usually like it, it's so long,
I'm bad.
Andrea, and I know that she does it like for good cause. But still, like, for that case, it's probably.
The question I even had to work, it was like for nutrition. Something is like, it's diet, like 24 hours a day, it's not called one.
It's a ration, 24 ration.
You know what, I put breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because I didn't know that was good.
Maybe I'll get something.
I was like, what?
I didn't know the Ashton protein.
What was like 40, 60? I put 30, 70. The girl next to me had 50, 50, and I was like, that's right.
It was on.
I put water.
That was probably right. That was probably right. I guess.
They're hiring for specific. I honestly think like that's where there's multiple places.
It was about sales. Multiple choice.
And they're in their junior.
What's our match?
Yeah.
Whatever it was matching. It was matching. All the. I kinda got tripped up a little on the definition. I don't know why. I think it's because they were all right there. If that makes sense, yeah.
And he's like,
Hold on.
and I was like, I mean, he's really nice, but I'm like, how do you?
It's hard.
If I can get like that, yes.
It was the only question I had, like, and I was like, I'm not gonna sit in here like, I'm gonna freak out to me, like, which one is the breakfast, lunch, and dinner? I know. I'm there for like,
No question. I'm gonna go back to it right now.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to start feed formulation. Feed formulation is actually a fairly big chunk of your grade in this class. I don't remember how many feed formulation assignments I put in P2O, there's a lot. So you need to be able to understand how to do feed formulations. So what we're going to start talking about today is the basics of the program we're going to use to do feed formulation. We will start, once I can start sending you the assignments, we will start fairly basic, but by the time we're done, you should be able to handle doing feed formulations without me providing you a bunch of extra information. Be able to look up requirements for animals, what tables to go to, and entering, if needed, any feed composition, feed set composition numbers in the program. So all I want to do today is talk about the program. I emailed this to you yesterday. If you haven't checked your email, it's sitting in your inbox. You might want to open that in front of you now if you have that, because it'll make it easier to understand as we go through it. This is an Excel program I made many years ago, and I've edited it and updated it throughout the years, and it's fairly good. It is not a sophisticated program because I'm not that smart when it comes to Excel, and the sophisticated programs that are out there for feed formulations cost thousands of dollars, and MTSU does not have thousands of dollars. This program, though, works quite well for formulating for a variety of animals. I've used it. Other former students have used it for formulations. It works pretty well. if you enter the right information, understand the program. The only thing that will frustrate you about this program, it is what we call a trial and error method. That is a method of feed formulation. I didn't just make it up. Trial and error method, and this is a trial and error method, which is fine. So it's basic Excel functions when I built this. So let's talk about the program. Now let's start basic. There are two tabs here. So it's obviously, and you'll probably laugh when I say this. Over the years, I've had many students that try to formulate for pigs using the ruminant formulation and vice versa. Okay. So make sure you first of all understand what species you're dealing with. This tab here is monogastric, so that is this program. There is a ruminant tab, and that is the ruminant program. Okay, so make sure, don't try to formulate for monogastrics using the ruminant program. It will make no sense, and vice versa. Okay, so let's talk about the basic structure. But we're not going to necessarily do an actual formulation today here. If I can get around to it, I might send you your first formulation to start working on in the next couple of days. But it'll be fairly soon because you have so many to do. So let's talk about the basic structure of this formulation program. On the monogastric side, and the ruminant, it works the same way. It just looks a little different. On the monogastric side, you have three areas. You have the feedstuff composition, which is all this stuff at the top, starting with alfalfa meal, all the way down to where it says ingredient, all that stuff. That is feedstuff composition. So that is telling me what is in particular feedstuffs. Now, if you decide that you want to add extra feedstuffs that are not on this list, because I'm making it somewhat easy for you, I already give you a list of some common feedstuffs that you would probably use in monogastric diets. If you decide to use something else, that's perfectly fine. You would enter that information here, and you would, of course, though, have to enter feed composition numbers for that ingredient all the way across to make it valid. These numbers I've already entered for you. Where did I get those numbers? From the book, okay? And so if you were to add peanut meal may be on there. Yeah, peanut meal is on there. You were to add, I don't know, whatever. Then you would look it up in your book and you'd enter those numbers here. Okay? So if you add any additional ingredients. And you can actually easily modify the program and add more and more lines to this and keep growing this feedstuff library at the top. Of course, you have to adjust accordingly down at the other sections of the formulation program. So that's all the top is. You really probably, unless you're entering another ingredient, you won't really do much with these numbers up here. They're there. They're just numbers. If you look here, it's just a number that I entered out of the book. Okay, so these are all NRC numbers. Let's, though, define these columns because it is going to be important that you understand what these mean because I did use abbreviations here. The first column is CP. You also need to make sure that you note your units as we go through this. You have to be able to balance requirements and composition of the diet on the same units. So if you find a requirement for crude protein in grams per day and you're formulating on percent, that's not right. Those are not the same things. You have to find the requirements on percent. You have to find the requirements for ME for chickens in kilocalories per kilogram. If not, you can't find it and you have to convert it. Okay. So this is crude protein, as you already know that. This is metabolized energy for chickens. So obviously, if you are formulating any diets for poultry, even though it says chickens, we still use that number for all poultry. If you're doing any poultry formulations, you would use this particular column when you get down to at the bottom when you look at your requirements and your composition of ME. If you're doing a swine formulation, obviously use this. Don't screw that up. Don't do one for the other. Calcium, percent, total phosphorus, arginine. Now what's that? What is arginine? Amino acid, lysine, methionine, methionine plus cysteine, threonine, tryptophan, valine, okay, sodium, chloride, magnesium, potassium, copper, iron, manganese, selenium, zinc. So notice these are your macro minerals. Notice the units are in percentages. These are, and they're not all of them, but they're the important ones. These are your trace minerals or your micro minerals. They're in parts per million. Again, as we mentioned already, parts per million is equivalent to milligrams per kilogram. Here's vitamin A and vitamin D. You'll notice there's not a lot of numbers for those because we don't have a ton of vitamin numbers. Vitamin E, vitamin K. Those are your B or your fat-soluble vitamins. International unit per kilogram. International unit per kilogram. International unit per kilogram. Vitamin K in parts per million. So be aware of those units as you look at this. Okay, so that's the fat-soluble vitamins. Biotin, choline, folic acid, niacin, pantothenic acid, riboflavin, thiamine, vitamin B6, and vitamin B12. Those are all your B vitamins. Choline's technically not a B vitamin. We kind of lump it in there. Those are all in parts per million. So again, be aware of your units as we go through that. So that's all the stuff that you can potentially balance for. When we're doing feed formulations, we want to, in theory, balance for everything. In other words, we need to meet the animal's requirements with our diet for every single one of these things. Now, I'm not going to start out asking you to balance all of these at one time. That becomes very difficult because look how many things there are. And if you're having to balance all that, it gets complicated because when you change one thing to balance one thing, something else usually changes and it's not balanced anymore. So that becomes a little frustration. So we will start out fairly basic where I may ask you to balance your diets for maybe 5 of these or so, but we will add to that as we go through that. We'll always balance for crude protein. We'll always balance for metabolized energy or some energy fraction, and usually calcium and phosphorus because those are important. Probably lysine and methionine because those are the 2 most important amino acids. And usually I'll pick some of these macro minerals and maybe 1 or 2 micro minerals. But we will grow this so that you can formulate balance for more of these nutrients or these designated areas. Okay, so just be aware of that. So in theory, this program could balance for everything, and that would be the way these sophisticated $10,000 programs do. But it's all computer based. It's all these formulas in there that it balances it for you. You don't have to think much about it. We don't have that here. Okay, so you have to work a little harder on this one. All right, so that is feed composition. So that's just what's in that's your feed stuffs you can pick from and what's in it. Now you have to have that to do this. Remember, feed formulation is simply balancing what your diet contains with what the animal needs. If you don't meet the animal's requirements for something, it's not balanced. Okay? If you exceed their requirement, it may be balanced unless you exceed it too much. And if you exceed it too much, then you run into issues with toxicity in certain instances, and we'll talk about some of that. All right, so that's the first part of the program. The second part of the program, the green areas of the program are where that's your really working areas, okay? The green areas, that's where you're going to do a lot of changing. Now, a couple things to keep in mind on this first part, the green area. This is just putting in what % of your diet you want in certain of the feedstuffs that you can pick from, okay? So all this up here is just repeated down here. So if I want to create a diet, and you're not going to do this, but let's play with it for just a second. You can play with yours as well. If I want to create a diet that is 100% blood meal, I'm going to first turn the number lock on. I'm going to put 100 in there, and so that diet is 100% blood meal. So you notice down here, that totals it right there. That is important. I made a note. If that box right there, however you do this, if that box right there does not equal 100, then the formulation is not valid. Okay, it always has to add to 100. Now, if we look at 100%, no, we've added to 100 because 100% of our diet is blood milk. That's insane. You would never do that. But you can see, I'm going to drop down for a second. We'll come and explain this. You'll see that this diet contains 94.7% crude protein. You would never have a diet that contains 94.7% crude protein. When probably the most any animal would require in their diet would be like 30%. Okay. Yeah. What does it say? Is your number lock on?
Okay, so that has to add up to 100. That's going to be one thing you're always going to have to check, because this is going to be changing all the time. This number right here, it always has to equal 100. Now, I'm going to tell you this up front. Some of you will listen to me on this and some of you won't. The ones that don't listen to me, you're going to lose your mind trying to do this, because I don't know what it is about this, but people want to get way too creative. If you get too creative on this, you're going to be spending hours doing formulations. Don't overcomplicate this. Start out with a couple of ingredients and then work from there. In other words, if I'm formulating, here's my approach on monogastrics. If I'm formulating for monogastrics, I'm going to pick a source of energy, starch, and a source of protein. And I'm going to create that where it adds up to 100%. Then I'm going to check my balance. It's not going to be balanced with just that, but then I'm going to start adding some smaller incremental things to start correcting the balance issue. In other words, if I'm going to formulate a diet for poultry, because I know, now you might not know, and I understand that, and we'll go through some of this throughout the semester, what's normal, what's not. But I know that we're probably going to use, and we kind of talked about this, I'm going to use corn and soybean meal. Pigs are going to be the same way probably. Now, you might say, well, I want to use sorghum instead of corn. Fine. It's just a substitution. But I'm starting out with a source of energy, starch, and a source of protein. Am I going to formulate a diet that's 65% fat? There are things, and I'll talk about this, there are things that make no sense. If I tried to make a diet with 65% fat, first of all, it would be so far over the animal's energy requirement, it would be unreal. And second of all, it would create this nasty mess to have to deal with as far as handling the diet. So some of these things you can't use, and I will put restrictions on you as you learn some of this. But here's what I'm talking about. Some people will go in and say, before they even start, and it's just like, I'm trying to tell you, they'll put in, okay, let me put in 10% corn, let me put in 5% soybean meal, let me put in 1% ground limestone, let me put in 3% of this and 4% of that, and let's see what happens. It's a nightmare. Don't do that unless you want to spend hours doing this. And some people do spend hours doing this. Start out with two main ingredients, okay? A source of starch, energy, a source of protein. Corn, soybean meal, something. Now, ruminants are going to be a little different. I'll talk about that in a minute. So watch this. I'm going to just say, I'm going to put, you don't always have to start with this, but let's just see. I'm going to go 65% corn and 35% soybean meal. Okay, does that add up to 100%? Well, let me double check. Yeah, it does. Okay, does that meet the animal's requirements? We'll see in a minute. Now, the bottom part of this formulation, really, you won't touch any of these numbers here. These are just an area to plug in formulas. All this is doing, it's an additive effect. All this is doing is calculating for each ingredient that you decide to use what contribution to the total is coming from corn and what contribution is coming from, in this case, soybean meal. So if I do look at that, you'll notice everything else in this column is 0. But I see for corn, 6.76% of the total amount of crude protein in this diet is coming from corn, and 16.84% is coming from soybean meal. Right? And same with energy. I've got 2,447 kilocalories coming from corn, which makes sense. That's your energy. And 944 coming from soybean meal. These columns are added up to get your total. Again, you're not going to really deal much up here in these, but you are going to deal down here. This is what, based on that formulation, 65% corn, 35% soybean meal, there is my composition of that diet. Okay, that's it. It's the composition's done. It's as simple as that. It's 23.6% crude protein. It is 3,391 kilocalories of ME. So I'm feeding a chicken. If it's for pig, it's that. Calcium, phosphorus, it's all been added for you, okay? It's all the way across. It's already done the calculations for you. So I know now what is in that diet. Is this formulation done? No, because I know what's in the diet, but I don't know what the requirements of my animal is. That's where we have another green area. This is the requirement line. This is where you're going to have to look up requirements for these different nutrients that we're trying to balance for. Again, if I ask you to balance for everything on here, which I rarely do that. But if I did, you would have to look up every single requirement for every single one of these. Actually, for monogastrics, that's not that hard. But it's just a lot of numbers you have to look up. Okay, most of them are in one or two tables, believe it or not. You can get it all in one spot or one or two spots. But you have to enter the requirements in this line or this row here. So let's just play with this for a second. So if let's say we're formulating for broilers, the requirement for young broilers probably is going to be 22%, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's a requirement, okay? So I just put that in there. That's fine. So how do I know this is balanced? Well, I could just look and say, okay, there's what's in the diet. There's the requirement. Did I meet it? Well, you did, but I made it easier for you. I gave you a balance line or a balance row to do the calculations for you. Look up here at the actual calculation. It's nothing fancy. All I did was take composition and subtract requirement from it to give me 1.6. So what does this, just on this one, what does that 1.6 mean? So I am overfeeding in this formulation, I'm going to be overfeeding crude protein by 1.6%. Is that good or is that bad? It's not bad. It's actually not bad. You're always going to have a little, well, I say you're always, if you really get into this, you might really want to balance perfect. Even the sophisticated programs don't usually balance exactly perfect because there's always a little bit of wiggle room. I will give you restrictions on how much over on certain things you can be. Crude protein is 1. I will say you can't exceed 5% of the requirements. Did that exceed 5% of the requirement? No, it's 1.6. If the animal's requirements, however, are say 16, what's the problem there? I'm overfeeding it beyond 5. So you've got to make, and it'll all be on the sheet I give you, but you've got to be able to understand, okay, there's a restriction here. I'm overfeeding crude protein. I got to go back and formulate. Okay. Does that make sense? So you got to use that balance line. That's what you're going to really focus on. If this balance line, any of these that I ask you to formulate for is negative, what, Zach, close your computer, is negative, what does that mean? You're not getting enough. That means it's not balanced. If I ask you to formulate for crude protein and it's a negative in that balance line, did you balance it? No, you didn't meet the requirements, so then you have to go back and formulate. So anything I ask you to balance for, if it's negative on any of those, then we have a problem. Okay. For instance, if I've got the requirement for, let's go back and say this is broiler, and this is calcium. Let's say the requirement for calcium for a broiler is like 1.2, which is about close. Look at that. So off the top, you got to use common sense. Off the top, if I'm going to feed a corn soybean meal diet to a broiler, and it's going to be 65% corn and 35% soybean meal, what's my problem? I'm deficient in calcium, so what am I going to have to address just on that? I'm going to have to add something to give them more calcium, right? So let me show you what I would do in this case. Now I'm just looking at two things, just protein. Well, protein's good, but okay, so we got a little wiggle room here. So it's what I said though. Now that we've got these couple ingredients in there, now I can make small incremental changes. Right now I'm deficient on calcium. Let me play with that. So what do I add for calcium? Well, I may choose something that's a calcium supplement. Ground limestone. If you're not sure, you can always go back up here and look. Ground limestone is 37% calcium. So it's got the highest level of calcium. So let me add, am I going to add 20% of that? No, that makes no sense. But maybe I add, oh, I don't know. Let's just play with it. Let me add 1%. Okay, that's fine, right? I'm good, right? Look at that. So I've got to take away from something. What am I going to take away from? You could take away either one of them. We could try corn. I would say probably corn. Because remember, you're close on protein. You start taking away soybean meal, you might become deficient in protein. Let's go 64. Check your balance. Is it equal 100? It does. Now let's look. Look how much better I got. Okay. So now what would I do? Do one more. Let's go 2. Maybe. And let's take away, make that 63. Okay, and you can do halves or you can do quarter, you can do whatever you want to do. Decimals are fine. Getting closer, so you see where I'm going with this. So we keep going there, you'd add other sources. And it's not quite that easy because we're only balancing for two things. But notice what's happening in my balance for protein, which is not bad. But the balance is getting smaller. That means the requirements and composition are getting closer together, which is a good thing. But what you'll get frustrated with, because you're going to have to balance for more than just two nutrients. So you'll change one thing and another thing will go negative or something like that. So you got to be careful. So I will put restrictions on you in certain other instances. There will be now let me mention this while we're on it, because this is a common sense thing, but for some reason people don't understand. What is a ratio? Do you understand what a ratio is? Some people don't understand what a ratio is. If I have a 2-to-1 ratio of something, I've got this thing here and this thing here, and it's a 2-to-1 ratio. What does that mean? I got twice as much of this as I got this, okay? If I ask you to do a 2-to-1 ratio of calcium to total phosphorus, what does that mean? I want 2 times as much calcium in the diet as phosphorus, but I still want the requirements met. So if I look at now I did not plan it that way, but look at that. That is calcium. Now the calcium's not met, you got to address that. But if I ask you that I want a 2-to-1 calcium phosphorus ratio, here's calcium, here's phosphorus. Here's what's in the diet of those two. What's the ratio of the two? How do I determine what the ratio of calcium to phosphorus is in that particular instance? Take the amount of calcium, 0.88, divided by 0.44. And that gives me, I'll do it real fast, 0.88 divided by 0.44. And I did not plan it that way. I have no idea why it worked out that way. It's exactly a 2-to-1 ratio. Okay, it's not always going to be that. But if you do this, and it is a 1-to-1 ratio, when you do your composition or your balancing and your formulation, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio, but I ask you to do a 2-to-1 ratio, what do you got to do? You got to adjust how much calcium's in there to bump the calcium up without affecting the phosphorus to get to a 2-to-1 ratio. So if it's in a 2-to-1 ratio, you got to take that number divided by that number. And if it's a 1 point, then I ask you for a 2 and it's a 1.5, that's not a 2, okay? So you have to adjust accordingly. Does that make sense? What a ratio is. Some people don't understand ratios. That's a ratio. In this case, it's exactly 2-to-1 for some odd reason. But that's fine and dandy. But if I say, okay, if you turn that into me, and I ask for a 2-to-1 ratio, well, okay. Okay, you got a 2-to-1 ratio, but why am I going to hit you on points big time? Because it's not balanced. You don't have enough calcium. So you didn't meet the requirements. The worst thing you can do on feed formulations is not balance, because that means the animal's requirements are not met. Okay, so make sure that you're balancing. That's where you're going to lose most of your points. If you're going to lose points, you will lose them because things are not balanced. So make sure everything's balanced. Now, I will also put restrictions on certain things. Not everything. If I start putting lots of restrictions on every single thing, that becomes really frustrating. The more sophisticated programs, they do put restrictions on every single thing within a window, but it can handle that. You doing it kind of by hand is a little more challenging. But I will put restrictions on things like selenium, because selenium is a mineral required, but it can be toxic at fairly low levels. So we can't overfeed a lot of selenium because it will kill the animal. So you have to be careful. And also, I will note a few things that you ought to be aware of as far as safety factors for animals, overfeeding of crude protein. Why do we not want to overfeed crude protein to animals? It's expensive. That's the main reason. The secondary reason is if you feed way too much of it, it can actually affect the kidneys because the animal tries to get rid of all the nitrogenous waste coming from protein digestion, and it can blow up the kidneys. So, but the biggest reason is because it costs too much to overfeed protein. Okay, does anybody have any questions about it so far? Does it make sense? Some of you will enjoy that. I've never had anybody in the gray. I don't think. You either love this or you hate it. Okay? I'm serious. I've had people that absolutely love this, and they could do it. I've had students tell me before, I wish all we could do the whole time is feed formulation. And that's great. That's exciting. Some of you will hate this. It just depends on the person and how your brain thinks. It works, I think. All right, so this is monogastric side. Fairly straightforward. Remember the few points. That always has to equal 100. Do not make this more complicated than it has to be, though. Okay? Just be aware of that. Now, remember also, just a note, I've got it at several places, but everything when we do formulations on a dry matter basis, we'll talk a little bit later on how to convert that back to an as-fed and create a mixing sheet for a feed mill manager. But everything we're doing on a dry matter basis, that means all this has got to be on a dry matter basis, which it is. If you enter any new ingredients, those have to be dry matter basis. And when you do the requirements, and most of them are already there, but double check it, the requirements also have to be on a dry matter basis. The requirements you're going to get mostly from your book. Okay, and we'll start out, I will tell you what table to go to for your first couple. But as we move through it, I'm just going to give you the information on the animal that you're trying to formulate for. Then you've got to go find the requirements yourself. If it's not in your book, like a lot of poultry stuff, the stuff in your book on poultry is very, very outdated. I will give you supplemental stuff that will help you with the requirements on that. Okay, so that's the monogastric. The ruminant is actually easier because ruminants are actually easy to feed. So what? But now this looks a little different. Don't freak out. It's the same concept. I just made it look a little different. Okay, everything again on a dry matter basis. So you'll notice the big thing is that's it. Why do we not? Because on the monogastric, good Lord, we had all this stuff. We were going like crazy, all that stuff. Why do we have only these? Yeah, there's a few things you could probably add. But why do we only have these nutrients that we're worried about? Huh? Yeah, they get their other nutrients from themselves. That's a good way to put it. Is they're ruminants. Do we worry about B vitamins in ruminants? No, the microbes in the rumen make it. Do we worry about vitamin K? No, the microbes make it. Okay. Do we worry about vitamin A? Maybe, but most ruminants consume a lot of plant material, and plants by nature have a lot of vitamin A in it. Do we worry about vitamin D? Where do most ruminants live? Outside, and they have access to sunshine that activates the vitamin D in their skin. Okay, so there's some things the rumen, the microbes in the rumen help us with that we don't have to worry nearly as much about some of the requirements. Now, you could worry about a lot of the trace minerals, the macro minerals as well. We typically don't. We probably should in ruminants, but ruminants, the rumen doesn't help us a lot on mineral requirements like it does vitamin requirements. There are some minerals we would look at. Most people in ruminant world tend to just want to supplement with trace mineral premix of some sort and let it go, and that's kind of the approach. So we don't usually look too much at that as far as mineral requirements for ruminants. All right, so what we have is these ingredients are not the same. I didn't have citrus pulp for monogastrics. Why? Because it would make no sense to feed citrus pulp. Okay, I did not have ryegrass hay because it would make no sense. Now, if you want to feed something else, even if you have your own animals, maybe, and you have a hay analysis of some mixed grass hay or Bermuda grass, whatever, and you want to put it in there right there. And if you put legitimate numbers in there and you want to use that in your formulation, I'm fine with that because that's the way you will grow in using this program. So these are a little bit more ruminant-focused ingredients. So these are the ones you can choose from. Again, if you want to add to it, that's certainly fine. I do give you a vitamin mineral premix. I also did that on the monogastrics as well. So usually I'll put restrictions on how much of that you can use because you don't want to use too much of it. So there is that if you need that. Now don't complicate this as well. What's the thing here's a couple things to keep in mind. These are ruminants. What does that mean about how we need to feed them? When I think of a ruminant, what's the first thing I need to think about? Roughage. Why? Because I don't care what the ruminant is. I don't care if it's a peak lactation dairy cow. I don't care if it's a growing goat kid. I don't care what it is. They're still ruminants. And if they don't have a functioning rumen, they're not going to do anything. Okay? So the first thing to think about is some level of roughage or forage in their diet because you have to keep the rumen alive. If you feed a ruminant like a monogastric, then you're going to eventually kill them, okay? So you always need to think about roughage or forage. When I reformulate for ruminants, I'm always going to start out with a high percent, maybe 100% of a roughage, of a forage. So I may come in here and say, I want to start this out with feeding 100%, a little expensive, but, you know, whatever, 100% alfalfa hay. Okay, that's a good start. Does that meet the animal's requirements? I don't know. Depends on the animal. It might meet the requirements for, say, a growing bull. It might meet the requirements for, certainly would meet the requirements for a dry dairy cow, okay? But it's probably not going to meet the requirements for a growing beef steer. But it might be a starting point or silage or whatever. But remember, you always have to have some level of roughage in there. Is there a minimum? Depends on the animal a little bit. We start getting into something along the lines of peak lactation dairy cow or feed yard steer, you might be approaching 25% roughage, which is pretty low. But so that's where we get into that, you know, keeping the rumen on the edge of becoming acidotic. So this way, be careful of that. So always err on the side of feeding too much roughage as long as you meet their requirement, because these are ruminants. You got to keep the rumen alive first. That's priority number one. Now, the way I did this looks a little different. Here's the green box, though. This is just the calculations that were at the lower level of the monogastric formulation. Here's the green box you're working from. So this is how much is in your diet, or how much you're going to put in your diet. So if you want to put 100% alfalfa hay, notice these numbers changed across here because now we're calculating the contribution coming from alfalfa hay in this case, which that's all we're feeding. And again, this adds up to 100, must add up to 100 to be legitimate. There's your composition. That's 19% crude protein in that particular alfalfa hay I put in there, which is just out of your book. That's a lot of protein for any ruminant. So that's probably overfeeding protein. So we probably wouldn't want to do that, and alfalfa hay is expensive, but it's a starting point. Now, let's define these columns. They look a little different. Crude protein, same thing. NEM, what does that stand for? Net energy for maintenance, mega cows per kilogram. And then NEG, which was net energy for growth, mega cows per kilogram. I do not have net energy for lactation in here. I certainly could add another column. I don't do a ton of formulations typically for lactating dairy cows. I could. It's not a big deal. Just add another column to it and get that information for the feedstuffs, and that's, you just move on with it. So NEM, NEG, mega cows per kilogram, calcium, total phosphorus, sodium. Sodium is important. Zinc and selenium. Those are the two I'm going to focus on. Those do tend to be a little bit of an issue in ruminants as far as supplementation. And then vitamin E. That's the one vitamin the rumen does not make. Okay? And so we do have to worry about supplementation a little bit of vitamin E or having enough in their diet. So that's in international units per kilogram. So remember your units. You might have to make conversions. Even you might have to make conversions from mega cows. If you have a requirement that's mega cows per pound, you got to convert that to mega cows per kilogram before you can balance. So be careful about that. So here's the area where you'd put the requirements. You would look those up. You would enter those. Now, I will say this much on ruminants. I usually do have you balance for everything because you only have just a few. That's not that big a deal. But I will have probably from time to time ask you to do a calcium phosphorus ratio, or maybe all the time. What's this calcium phosphorus ratio right here? What's that one? If I ask you to do a 2-to-1, is that a 2-to-1? What is that one? It's like 7.76 to 1. That's what that particular alfalfa has. I mean, alfalfa has a lot of calcium in it anyway. That's a problem with alfalfa, actually, is too much calcium. So to make that a 2-to-1, if I want to still feed alfalfa, to make that 2-to-1, what do I do? I need to reduce some alfalfa, obviously, and then add something with phosphorus, something with phosphorus in it. So I'm going to go with ground limestone, right? I don't know. What's ground limestone going to do to you? It's going to raise calcium. We don't want to do that. So I did give you ammonium phosphate here as a possibility. So you can play with that as well. Or you could simply just not feed as much alfalfa and pick something else and play with it that way too. So you don't always have to do it that way. Couple things on this to note. I'm not putting major restrictions on it, but people get carried away with some things, and it might be because you don't just don't know a whole lot about feeding animals. But you know, if I were to say I want to feed, let me just do a diet that I've seen before. I say I've seen it. It's something similar. 10% Bermuda grass hay and let's say 50% bakery waste and 40% corn. Is that 100%? Yeah. How's a ruminant going to do on that? I only got 10% roughage, first of all. That's problematic. I've got way too much. The ruminant would go insane. I got corn and bakery waste. I see things like this. I see people that put way too much fat or way too much molasses because they don't think of the practical aspects of it. They're just trying to balance. If you balance something that's going to kill the animal, you defeated your purpose in balancing if you're going to kill the animals with it. So don't feed too much fat, very little to ruminants. They don't do well on lots of fat. Don't feed very much molasses because they also don't do very well on that. These very highly concentrated feedstuffs like corn, like a bakery waste, some of that, be careful with how much of that you feed. But the liquid stuff, the high energy stuff like fat and molasses, because that's all that is energy, be very restrictive on how much you feed of that. We don't feed a ton of fat, period, to ruminants. We feed more molasses to them in certain supplements or whatnot. But ruminants don't do well on fat anyway. So, all right, does that make sense? Do you have any questions on the ruminant one? Again, same thing on the balancing here. That's going to calculate, did you meet the requirements or did you not meet the requirements? Everybody good, ready to start formulating? Okay. That's all we're going to do today. I will probably, what's today, Wednesday? So I won't see you till Monday. I probably won't by Monday. Maybe on Monday I will. Maybe we'll practice one on Monday. You want to practice one? Okay, maybe we'll do a little practice one. I'll get one of my basic ones and we'll bring it and do a practice so you can get a feel for it. Don't forget next Wednesday you have no class, and then isn't the following Monday your feed identification exam? Okay, so be preparing for that. Those samples are in the lab, along with a lot of other stuff in there, but if you need to get in the lab, let somebody know. All right, so I will see you then on Monday. Everybody have a good weekend. Yeah.
Peter, we're running unlicensed office, so I don't think they can use Excel and stuff. That's why a bunch of people are having issues putting stuff in.
Should be.